Welcome to another session on the best year of your life. I'm your co-host for this session, Fleet Mall, and I'm really excited to be here today with Dr. Richard Schwartz. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Fleet. I'm honored to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you here. Dr. Richard Schwartz is the founder of Internal Family Systems Therapy, and our day today is focused on relationships. And actually, I think the IFS work could really underlie any of the days of this summit because it's really about self-understanding and healing and sort of healing those things that could get in the way of any parts of our lives that we want to move forward in. But we will focus on relationships today. So I want to share a little bit about your background for our audience, and then we'll jump right into the conversation, okay?
Sounds good.
So Dr. Richard Schwartz began his career as a systemic family therapist and an academic. Grounded in systems thinking, Dr. Schwartz developed internal family systems in response to clients' descriptions of various parts within themselves. He focused on the relationships among these parts and noticed that there were systemic patterns to the way they were organized across clients. He also found that when the client's parts felt safe and were allowed to relax, the clients would experience spontaneously the qualities of confidence, openness, and compassion that Dr. Schwartz came to call the self with a capital S. He found that when in that state of self, clients would know how to heal their parts. Dr. Schwartz has published many books and over 50 articles about internal family systems. Some of his better-known books include Internal Family Systems Therapy, which is in its second edition, came out in 2019. The second edition did. You Are the One You've Been Waiting For, 2008, and your most recent book, No Bad Parts, Healing Trauma and Restoring Wholeness with Internal Family Systems Model, which lists as co-author Alanis Morissette. I found that quite interesting. I don't know what her role was there, but she seems to be interested in these things because I actually listened to a summit talk that she did with my colleague, Dr. Dan Siegel. So, yeah.
She gets around. She did the foreword. She didn't co-author.
Oh, she did the foreword. Okay, that's why her name is there. Okay, that kind of makes sense. Not to take any away from Alanis Morissette, but yeah, she did the foreword. Okay, great. So, and that book, even its title, No Bad Parts, I think really points to what I understand about the context of your work, that it's very much grounded in what my own teacher called a sense of innate basic goodness and wholeness and self-acceptance and self-compassion and so forth. And it's about embracing and so forth. And so I love the idea of no bad parts. That gets right to the point of things. And I think it's so important in our culture today where there does seem to be so much shame that somehow has become almost endemic in the culture. Yeah.
Totally agree.
So this summit, the best year of your life, is about self-actualizing or realizing our dreams and goals and optimizing the various domains of our life, our physical health and well-being, our financial health and well-being, the quality of our relationships, our spiritual journey, and so forth. And even with a clear vision and strong motivation for where we want to go with our lives, we often find ourselves stumbling and with seemingly unconscious things sort of getting in our way, and sometimes, just really blocking our what feel like really strong intentions that we have to move forward in our lives. So it would seem that internal family systems is kind of pointing to that domain where there are things that can get in our way that need healing and maybe integrating and so forth. So I'm wondering if you could just talk about, and my understanding is that your background, as I read in your bio just now, was from family systems therapy. So could you talk about how this arose and maybe the relationship between internal family systems and external family systems?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, as you read, I was a fairly zealous family therapist who, like so many family therapists back in the day, thought individual therapists who were mucking around in the inner world were wasting their time because we could change all that by just reorganizing family systems, and decided to try and prove that with an outcome study, and found that my clients didn't cooperate. We could reorganize the families just the way the book said to, and they still kept, at the time I was working with a group of bulimics, so they kept binging and purging. And out of frustration, I began asking why, and they started talking this, at the time, strange language of parts. And they would say, you know, when something bad happens, this critic attacks me inside, and that brings up a part that can make me feel totally worthless and ashamed, like you're saying, shame. And that feeling is so dreadful that almost to the rescue comes the binge and turns me into an unfeeling eating machine. But the critic then attacks me for the binge, and that brings back that empty, young, worthless feeling. So the binge has to come back. And so as I listened to that, it sounded familiar because it sounded like some of the patterns I was studying in families and trying to intervene into. And so I began experimenting with clients about how we could change some of this, and made the mistake that most of our culture and most psychotherapy still makes, which was to assume these parts were what they seemed. So the critic is just a bundle of parental introjected voices, and the binge is an out of control impulse. And so when you think of it that way, you have to use willpower to try and stand up to the critic or control the binge. And that was, as I was doing that with clients, it was totally backfiring. They were getting worse. But I was like the man in a hole with a shovel. I didn't know what else to do but stand up stronger, control more, until a client who cut herself. Uh, and I decided I couldn't let her keep doing this under my watch. And so, and by that time, I was having clients interact with these parts, and had my client just badger the part about not doing it that next week, and I would badger the part. And then finally, it agreed not to, and I came in the next session, and she had a big gash down the side of her face, and I just emotionally collapsed and spontaneously said, I give up. I can't beat you with this. And that was a turning point in the history of this work, because the part said, I don't really want to beat you. And I shifted out of that coercive place to just being curious. Then why do you do this to her? And the part proceeded to tell the story of how when she was being sexually abused as a child, it had to get her out of her body, and it had to contain the rage that would get her more abuse. And so I shifted again, not just curious, but I have a kind of compassion and appreciation for the heroic role it played in her life. And I could convey that to the partner, broke into tears because everyone had vilified it and tried to get rid of it. And that was, as I say, a turning point in the history of this work, because from that point on, I started to just get curious about these parts that seem so destructive or crazy. And in doing that, learned that each of them had a kind of secret history of how they were forced into the role they were in, and how much often they hated doing it, but they thought it was absolutely necessary. And how so many of them were still frozen in time during the trauma, during the abuse scene, and thought the client was still 5 or 6 years old and they had to keep doing this. And so that totally changed my perspective about all kinds of symptoms and things that we think we have to control with willpower, like New Year's resolutions, you know, where we just swear we're not going to do it this year, or we're going to lose weight, or whatever it is. And there's certainly parts of us that really want that, and we'll try to be little drill instructors inside to try and, you know, shame us into doing it. But there's a lot of parts that aren't on board and feel shamed, which makes them act even more extreme. So we get into these battles and polarizations inside. And the ones who aren't on board will actively sabotage in what seems like an unconscious way.
Wow, I'm sure that's sounding very familiar to any of us who've struggled with addictions in our lives or had family members, loved ones, and friends struggling with addictions. You know, it seems like most modern therapeutic models from Freud and Jung onward have, you know, identified various subpersonalities and parts of various kinds. Even Gurdjieff talked about the multiplicity of eyes that make up the illusion of a central eye. And so in internal family systems, um, is there like an infinite number of parts, or is there a certain, you know, parts that we work with? I know you have these categories. I think of managers, exiles, and firefighters. So how does this kind of work in terms of as we begin to work with this? It seems like it could almost be endless.
Yeah, well, I don't know if there's a finite number. I think there probably is, but um, the the basic assumption, and again, and this is in contrast to many models that think about parts, but basic assumption is um, it's the natural state of the mind to have them. Like we come into the world with them either manifest or dormant, and then they're all valuable. They all have important aspects, important talents to give us to help us in our lives. And they're forced out of their naturally valuable states by these traumas and attachment injuries and what we go through as kids often into these roles that can be extreme. And so as I studied this and being a systems guy, I looked for distinctions and patterns. And the big distinction that leaped out immediately was between parts that before they were hurt were these precious inner children, childlike parts that had lots of innocence and playfulness and creativity and so on. But then they got hurt or shamed or terrified. And now they carry what we call the burden of emotional pain or the burden of worthlessness or the burden of terror. And so we don't want anything to do with them anymore. And we lock them away in inner basements or abysses or cysts, not realizing that we're locking away our most precious parts often, thinking we're just moving on from the memories, sensations, emotions, and beliefs of the trauma. And so as you gather a lot of what I call exiled parts, parts that are locked up inside, and you try your best to stay away from them, other parts have to go into protective roles. And some of them try to control the world so that it doesn't trigger your exiles. Because if one of those hurt parts or those scared parts gets triggered, it can overwhelm you with that emotion and make it so you can hardly function. And so you need a lot of other parts working hard all the time to keep them from getting triggered. So nothing similar ever happens again. And some of them will try to control your relationships, like the theme of this talk. So they don't let anybody get close enough to trigger those exiles, maybe, or they try to control the behavior of your partner so that they don't get triggered. They'll try to control your appearance so that you don't get rejected. They try to control your performance so you get a lot of accolades to counter the worthlessness. Some of them go into roles where they're trying to please everybody and take care of everybody else, and they don't let you take care of yourself. So on. There are a lot of common, we call manager protector roles. And some of them are the critics. They think the best way to motivate you or to get you to look better or to lose weight or whatever they want is to yell at you constantly and use your parents' voice to, because you did listen to your parents, so they use your parent voice to motivate you. So these we call the managers, one class of protector. The other class, in contrast to the manager, is more like an emergency team that managers are trying to preempt the exiles getting triggered. Once they do get triggered, it's a big emergency. So there's a whole other group of parts who will immediately go into action to get you away from that pain or away from the shame or the terror. And they often tend to be impulsive and reactive, and they don't care about the collateral damage they do to your body or to your relationships. They just want to get you away from that somehow, either distract you or douse the flames of emotion with some kind of substance or get you higher than those flames. So we call those firefighters. They're fighting the flames of the exile's emotion. So that's the classification system. Again, I want to emphasize these are not the essence of these parts. They're the roles they've been forced into. And once released from these roles, they'll revert to their naturally valuable states. And that's a lot of what IFS is about, is helping these parts transform back into who they were designed to be.
Well, I think it's beautiful that your model starts with this kind of fundamental validation that these parts are not simply something that's been interjected from our parents, some superego notion or healthy or unhealthy parent, and they're not simply maybe adaptations that came up around our role in the family, being the troublemaker, the clown, or what have you, and that there is some level of these that we're born with, and it almost seems to point to something like karma or something. I mean, and it also, as I listen to you talking, you could just be describing kind of psychological dynamics of how our mind works and how our conditioning works. But I know in your work that you actually have conversations with these parts and they have conversations with others. They seem to actually have their own voice and beingness. So that's a little more than just a dynamic. So yeah, go further.
Yeah, and that's been a tough sell in the psychotherapy world and our culture, because talking to yourself or having voices inside has been so pathologized. And multiple personality disorder or schizophrenia is all about that. And I am talking about, in a sense, multiple personalities. What it's kind of a spectrum. So people who would be classified as, now it's called DID, but multiple personality disorder, are at one end of that spectrum of who we all are. And the only difference between us and them is that because of the horrific trauma they suffered, their parts got very separated and polarized. And so when one takes over, the others take off. But otherwise, what are called alters in that world are basically the same as what I'm calling parts. They're full range personalities who have autonomy. They have lots of different feelings from one another, and it's like a little family in there.
So it's really, because sometimes we talk about, or we hear in terms of trauma, and fortunately there's a lot more awareness around trauma in our society than ever before. A lot of really fascinating summits going on and so forth around trauma. That as a result of trauma, there's often a splitting or fragmentation, which one might assume, well, that's where these parts come from. They come from that splitting or that fragmentation. But I think you're saying that no, there's already an underlying tableau of these parts, and what happens more is that their harmonious function gets disrupted by the trauma or something like that. Is that accurate?
Exactly. That's exactly right. And as I say, it's a tough sell, because that has been the paradigm, that our healthy mind is unitary, and then it gets fragmented by trauma into these shards of the broken vase. And the goal is then to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, to bring them back into one mind. And so it's a very different goal in IFS. The goal is instead to help them out of their back into their naturally valuable states, and help them achieve harmony inside. But none of them disappear. They don't go away. They're just in there. You don't notice them nearly as much because they're not an extremis, but they're there, and they're now integrated in the sense of everybody gets along with each other. And also, just while we're on this, what I consider to be the biggest contribution or discovery of IFS is that just beneath the surface of these parts is a kind of essence that we all have, that I just stumbled into by getting parts to separate from each other, and then suddenly this other person would emerge who knew how to relate in the inner world in a healing way and manifest qualities like curiosity and confidence and compassion and courage. And so we have what we call the 8 C's of what I call self-leadership, with a capital S, as you mentioned. And that's in everybody. And it can't be damaged. Even with people with horrific trauma, as you get these parts to open space, it's the same damn self that shows up. And it knows how to heal, both in the inner world and in the outer world. And As I tried to ground that observation in traditional psychotherapy, psychology, I couldn't find many analogies. And it wasn't until I started to look more in the spiritual world that I could actually find concepts that matched what I was uncovering that way.
Well, again, this is just so fascinating, and I think there would be models that would think that there is a greater self of which all these other parts are parts, right? And it seems like here you're almost asserting that there is this self with a capital S that has these natural self leadership qualities and qualities of competence and compassion and caring and the ability to heal and self heal. That is not necessarily the sum total of these other parts, but it is another part of ourselves that has that ability. And that when that part of ourselves is in the lead, our life is probably going to unfold in a more satisfying way.
That's
Is that
exactly
fair to
what I'm
say?
saying. Yeah, exactly right, Fleet. And one of the goals then, I was talking about goals before. So yeah, one goal is to release these parts, liberate them from their extreme roles so they can be who they're designed to be, and to help them get along with each other and have harmony. But an even bigger goal for me now has become helping them come to trust self with a capital S as the leader,
Mm.
and that they don't have to do it. So because a lot of them are what in family therapy we used to call parentified children. They're parentified inner children who had to do it when you were a kid and feel like they still have to do it. They still have to run your life. And they don't really know. They're not equipped to run a whole person. So as they relax and see oh my God, there is this other guy in there. Maybe I can let him handle stuff. I can be an advisor, or I can, do something entirely different. Uh, it's a big relief, and it turns out that this self can handle both the inner world and the outer world in a more effective way.
Well, it's so interesting just extrapolating that out into the outer world that I could just see leadership trainings that, I mean, obviously, if we're going to be a really good leader, learning how to connect with that inner self, right, that can do that kind of self leadership and gain the trust of all the multiplicity of parts within ourselves. If we can do that effectively, we will probably be pretty good at leading others as well.
Yeah, and in fact, we're moving out of just the psychotherapy world now. We have a pilot training for executive coaches happening
Mm-hmm.
in a month or so, because of that, because coaches have become very, very interested in bringing more self-leadership to corporations or nonprofits or social activism. So we're starting to actually have trainings for leaders.
Now, that's really interesting. And the whole world of coaching, life coaching, and executive coaching is a real through line of this summit, obviously. And I do a lot of coaching work myself, and a lot of the work that I do is really all about helping people get in that self-leadership position with ourselves in order to be able to lead others effectively and influence others in a positive way. And this really aligns with kind of my own, now that I reflect on it, the experience of what I've actually seen and what works and what goes on. I didn't quite have this same language for it, but it's really fascinating. So you spoke about how some of these natural parts of ourselves become exiles, and when these triggers happen, the firefighters come in to put out the fire, often with unhealthy coping mechanisms. But that initial, the exiling, or I know you talk about um, some kind of burden attaching to these parts. And one of those is shame. I wonder if you could talk about this notion of these burdens, and if there are others besides shame, and then how they end up attaching to these parts. And then what is the process of unburdening the parts, if you will? Is it a process of letting go or getting rid of things, or is it a process of integration? Or yeah, so I'm sorry, big question, but you start
It's
wherever
a
you
good
like.
question. So the definition of a burden is an extreme belief or emotion that came into your system from some external experience, or that you inherited from your family lineage or your ethnic group. Those are called legacy burdens, or from the burdens that are floating around in our culture. So, but it's an extreme belief or emotion comes into your system and attaches to one of these parts or more than one. and then drives the way the part operates, almost like a virus, like the coronavirus. And so parts are extreme partly because they're frozen in time in the traumas, but also because they picked up these viruses, these burdens that drive them. And, uh, shame is probably the most potent burden because
Mm.
when you feel shame, you feel worthless. There's a kind of primal terror about survival that comes with that. Because we all knew as babies and kids that if we were not valued, we were going to die. And many kids do die because they're not valued. So, with that shame comes that incredible desire to get away from it and to get whoever told you you were bad to change their mind so you'll survive. And so that is one of the most powerful burdens that a part can carry. And often the fear of being shamed organizes a lot of our lives.
Well, let me ask you a little more about shame before maybe talking about other burdens and the process of letting go of our burdens, because I've kind of dedicated my life to ridding the world and our culture of a culture of blame and shame. Just a very small project I've taken on, but it's really what motivates me. And what I see as being so powerful and detrimental about shame is that, as you mentioned, in early childhood, really we're in an existential situation, right? And so we start putting together a self structure out of whatever's around because we can't go back to the womb. We have to survive. We have to put something together to navigate this world we're in. And so, if there's shame in the landscape there, we build that into our self structure. And we all get some of it. I don't think anybody comes through childhood unscathed. And sadly, many people get way too much of it. But nonetheless, it seems like it's such a powerful identifier and becomes so familiar that we will actually, I think, in some cases, seek that shaming experience in life because we get to say, I'm here. It becomes part of our sense of home. And I think it explains some of the acting out around some sexual addictions and even, sexually abusive behaviors and so forth that the person knows that acting out is going to lead to an experience of shaming. I'm just wondering about your thoughts about that. And that's why I think the whole issue of shame is something that I just feel like we really need to have I just think it's one of the core things we need to deal with collectively.
Well, since we're talking about relationships here, I find that it's a real driver in relationships. So if you came out of your family feeling shamed by, let's say, your father, or in our case, a mother, my case, and you have this, then when you see somebody as a potential partner who resembles that person in some way, and they're nice to you, they seem to like you and value you, there's a kind of euphoria you get with infatuation because this might mean you'll be redeemed. If this person who resembles your original caretaker changes their mind and says, no, you aren't bad, you're good, then you're not going to die, basically, is what it comes down to.
Mm-hmm.
And so we often get attached to somebody who does resemble one of our parents for that reason. And it turns out often that they do resemble that person and they hurt us in the same way. And when that happens, your protectors go into one of 4 or 5 projects. And one of them is to change the person back into who they're supposed to be, the redeemer they're supposed to be. So you start to aim all your change attempts at getting them to stop yelling at you or to stop being mean, which usually backfire, or to change yourself so that they will be nice to you again and like you again. Or when those don't work often, you decide, actually, this wasn't the right redeemer. That person's still out there. And you go looking again for the right person. Or when you get burned enough, you just give up on getting it from a outside person and you you go to work or alcohol or drugs or some way of dealing with this exiled pain inside and shame. And so most couples come into therapy in one or another of those projects with each other. And uh, what we found is as long as their focus is on getting their partner to take care of their exiled parts that way, then it's not going to work. So our goal becomes helping each partner become what I'll call the primary caretaker to their own exiles, which frees up the other person to be like the secondary caretaker of those exiles. And most of us have that reversed. We really want that person because we don't know what the hell to do with our own exiles. So we really want that person to come in and let those young parts of us know they're valued. And anyway,
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that when we get into into relationships, especially our primary relationships, we're really playing out the ghosts of our childhood and the ghosts of our family of origin dynamics. And on the one hand, that can lead to a lot of suffering. But on the other hand, it can be really the landscape, the opportunity for our personal evolution.
totally. And that, I say my wife is a great tormentor with a hyphen between the tor and the mentor, because by tormenting me, she's teaching me what I need to heal. So, so on a good day, when I get triggered by her, I don't just go after her. I look inside and I find the part that got hurt, and then I start a process of actually healing that part. So I think that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, well, I think our audience would like to hear your wife's side of that story too,
Yeah,
probably.
yeah, don't tell her I said all that.
um, yeah, I'm sure this is just sounding very familiar to all of our audience that because we all experience these things and struggle with these things, and sometimes simply having a language for it can be very liberating to begin to sort it out and have a sense that right, and that maybe there's a pathway. So could you talk about that a bit about how we do um, heal these burdens that have attached to various traumas or various things? What is the pathway to healing in this internal family systems model?
Yeah, so um, the first step is to do this U-turn in your focus if it's a relationship and start to notice what's happening in response to your partner. And then usually you'll notice the protectors first. And let's say there is a part that's very angry, and I'll notice where it's in my body, and I'll try to get curious about it. Even if other parts don't like it, I'll get them to open space so myself can be present, and I'll be curious, and I'll ask it, tell me more about your anger, and get my out of my thinking part, because I wouldn't be thinking the right answer. So I'm literally just waiting for an answer to come from that place in my body.
Mhm.
Tell me why you're so angry, and or what you're afraid would happen if you didn't get so angry. And in answering that question, I'll learn about what it's protecting, which is usually one of these very raw little boys in there. And I'll ask it if it would give me permission to try and help that boy. And there are often some fear about that, about letting me go to it. But if I negotiate that fear and get permission, then I would focus on the vulnerable feeling that this one was protecting. And for me, I don't get images, but a lot of people would see a child, see themselves as a child. But I would, for me, I just sense that hurt in another place in my body, and I would then try to get curious about it. And often I'll immediately feel compassion for that little guy, and I'll let him know. And there's a process by which I would connect with that part so he would feel like I cared about him. And I used to think that was enough, and now we're good. But it turns out, as I said, that these parts are frozen in the past. So the next step is what we call witnessing. And I would ask him to let me know what happened to make him feel this bad in the past. And I might see scenes from my past. I would feel a lot of emotion. I would um, have various sensations, and my body would move. And so all of that is in the service of witnessing what this part went through that I had tried to forget about and move on from. And now finally I'm coming and he's getting a sense of what it was like, that I'm getting a sense of what it was like for him, which is very healing for these parts. And then the next step is I would literally go into that scene or time period and be with him in the way he needed somebody. And I would do that until he felt taken care of back there. And then bring him out of that time period to present, somewhere else in my body, or to a fantasy place he'd enjoy. And after all of that's taken place, I would ask him if he was ready to unload all this pain now that he doesn't need it, or now that he's not stuck back there with it. And most of the time they are. And then we just have a kind of menu of the elements that we say, what would you like to give it up to? Light, water, fire, wind, earth, anything else. The part picks one of those, we send all this pain out of its body off into the light. And now he's a happy little guy and he just wants to play. Uh, and then I bring in all the other parts to see they don't, like the angry guy, to see that he doesn't have to protect him anymore. And now what does he want to do instead of this protective, angry role? And we might have to unburden his anger. So that's the way it goes.
Wow. So, well, from where you began, and even in referencing your own personal work around your relationship, that's one of the great insights of Western psychology, is that which triggers us is the direct window into our own internal landscape, right? And we don't like it, but it's the doorway in, right? And as you were describing that work, you are describing it almost as if you could do this for yourself. Now, I'm sure this can be skillfully guided, ideally by a therapist and a one-on-one. I know sometimes this can be done in group work and workshops and so forth. But can someone use these principles to work with themselves? Is there any self-directed way people can work with these principles?
Yeah, it, there's a kind of spectrum on that. So I'm amazed because there are people who can do the whole thing by themselves, even with these very, very delicate, vulnerable places that they go to. And then there are other people like me who, what I described just now about my own work, I need somebody there to keep my protectors from coming in and shutting it down and
Mm-hmm.
just
Mm-hmm.
to keep it going. And I have somebody I trade sessions with, and so we do that. Uh, so there is that kind of range. There are there are people that can do a lot of work with their protectors on their own, but when it comes to going to those exiles, they need somebody. So I wrote this book, No Bad Parts, to try and help people try it out on their own and see how far they can get. And with the strong encouragement, if you get stuck or you're having any kind of bad reaction, to find somebody to help.
Another through line for our summit is contemplative practices, meditation, mindfulness, things like a lot of our audience are mindfulness practitioners, meditation practitioners, and and I know you have a background with meditation as well. I'm curious if meditation with good technique, properly understood with that context of openness, curiosity, self-compassion, acceptance, that kind of, if that almost does some of this work in an organic way, maybe not as deliberately, but or maybe it would be a wonderful adjunct because it does kind of do that work in a kind of organic way. I wonder about your thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think it can be both. I mean, I think mindfulness, for example, in noticing your thoughts and emotions, you're separating from them. And whenever you separate from what I call your parts, you access self. So you're in a state of self and you can be very accepting of your thoughts and emotions that way. Now, for me, that's a great first step, but it isn't necessarily healing. I think it can be healing spontaneously, but for me, it's not compassionate to witness suffering beings parade by passively. So the next step would be to to think of these not as ephemeral thoughts and emotions, but as parts of you that carry, pain or shame or terror or
Hmm.
anger, whatever it is, and begin to get to know them. And you can only do so much of that with, without needing a break. And so there are a lot of people that do IFS and also do mindfulness, and the the mindfulness is kind of the daily practice, and then they'll come to a session and do the IFS, and it reinforces they reinforce each other. Now, I did meditation at I did TM back in the day, I think I
Hmm.
started in the early 70s, mainly as a spiritual bypass, as a way to get away from my exiles. Because
Hmm.
I could use the mantra and I could get in this very high state, and it really made me feel great and helped me function in the world. And I was far less anxious and all of that. So I thought I'd found the answer. And I wasn't doing anything for the parts that were left in the dust. And so that's my only critique of meditation is just don't use it for that. Uh, you can get, I still use my mantra every so often and get into that place of big self, the sort of unity, non dual state that we can go to, but bring some of that back. Bring that back to these parts. Don't
Hmm.
use it to get away from them.
Yeah, I think that's something we've had developed so much more awareness around, thankfully. And I think John Wellwood coined the term spiritual bypassing, and which isn't any negative judgment about meditation or its promises. It's just it can be co-opted uh, to not do our work. And I think so many of us have found, even after years and years of meditation, we still have these troubling characters that poke their head up every now and then, right? And obviously pointing to work we haven't yet done. And in this summit, we're we're hoping to have people kind of re-engage with their dreams, not give up on themselves, not give up on their life, even in the midst of what we're going through with this pandemic and everything, and kind of be willing to go after their dreams in whatever way that makes sense for them. It doesn't have to be fueled with a lot of ambition or anything, but just that stepping into that which what we maybe once dreamed was possible, and in whatever way that would be still possible at any point in our life. And and so really happy to see people maybe reignite passion and inspiration and motivation. And sadly, what the fear is that then at some point they'll be moving along and experience some kind of self-sabotage of some kind, and then lose heart and feel deflated once again, and go back into some cycle of self-shaming and then want to give up the whole affair. And so could you talk about that? Maybe are there parts of ourselves, maybe some of these innocent, childlike parts that hold those dreams? And what is the mechanism of sabotage or self sabotage, and how might we sort of inoculate ourselves about that, or at least be prepared when it does arise to work with it in a way where we don't lose heart?
Yeah. The way I think about it is what I'm calling self has a kind of sense of what we're here to do. And and there are these young childlike parts that also have their own dreams, and some of those are very synchronized. And so when you can get everybody coming together in the same vision, then it's kind of effortless a lot of the time. But there are also parts that have very different desires from those the self and some of those young parts. And if they feel left out of the project, then they will sabotage. And uh, and so, you know, ideally, on a good day, I'll have something in mind that I want to do that day, and I'll bring everybody together, and I'll say, "This is what I think we should be doing today. What do you guys think?" And it's like a board meeting or like a family planning time. And I just see who's up for it and who's not up for it. And if it's something I think is still really important, I'll just work with the parts and I'll say, okay, we're not going to do what you want today, but I'm going to work with you about a different thing, some other time. And so it becomes a negotiation in which there aren't any parts that feel like they didn't at least have a voice. And then you don't get the sabotage in the same way.
Well, that's really fascinating. I mean, when I think of, there's the idea within families, especially if they have, some good size of the family, have family meetings, family councils, family, that kind of thing. And the idea that we're kind of doing this internally, it's kind of fascinating. It seems a little humorous at the same time, somewhat, although I'm sure it's very effective. And there's still some part of me that's thinking like, there's a certain complexity to that. And maybe what I would really like is just for all those voices to go away so I can just kind of go about my life, right?
Get out of my way. Come on, let
Yeah.
me do what I want.
Yeah.
And how's that working for you?
Yeah, that's that. Always that great question. How's that working for you? Exactly. Yeah. So today we are focused on relationships. And, when you think about this, it's kind of, I mean, that we all have this multiplicity of parts or whatever we want to call them, subpersonalities and parts. And we all have our inherited burdens and some of this trauma that we can understand from our own childhood or even that we've experienced as adolescents or adults. And then some of it's historical trauma and legacy trauma and burdens of all kinds. And so we have this, our partners have this. We maybe even seek out partners that have similar landscapes or that are, as you said, reflective of our parents and or the sources of some of our trauma. And so it's kind of amazing that relationships work at all when, when you think about the complexity of this. So you did talk a little bit about, I thought that one idea you said, this seems to be pretty core, that rather than trying to find a partner who will become the parent for all of our parts, uh, to do that job or to find a way to do that job effectively ourselves so that the other person can maybe be a secondary parent. It's not like, we're both, I'm going to do my work, you do your work, and, we'll meet for tea and we have nothing to do with each other. We're obviously in relationship. So that idea of a primary parent and a secondary parent, I think is quite interesting. I wonder if you could go further with that.
Yeah. So uh, it it seems counterintuitive because we all came out of our families thinking there is this person out there that's supposed to be doing this for us. And
Mm-hmm.
attachment theory itself, which is the most prevalent, I think, theory in a lot of psychotherapy, basically says that you can only have these qualities that I mentioned, those 8C qualities, if you got them from some relationship when you were young, like good enough parenting. And so there is this implicit idea that you have to get the corrective experience from some relationship. And so it's counterintuitive to think that you can do that for yourself, or even that you should do that for yourself. But it is very possible. But to do it, uh, you have to work with a lot of the protective parts that don't want you going to these exiles and then get permission, because if you try to go there without permission, there'll be havoc also. And then you start that process of finding those parts that get hurt and holding them yourself in an inner world kind of way. And then I mentioned this earlier, but we could go into more of this, how much that frees your partner of this big responsibility of taking care of those parts of you, and how liberating that is for your partner, which that partner doesn't feel the constant upset from you that you're not, she or he is not doing what they're supposed to do, and they can uh, feel freed up to, and they're not. The other thing we try to do is speak for your parts rather than from your parts. So if I'm really upset by something my wife did, which happened this morning, I get away and I listen inside, and hopefully by the end of the day, I'll come to her and say, when you said that, it hurt this part, and this part got angry, and uh, rather than, what the hell are you saying? Why would you say something like that? Because too often, as we're talking about shame, when you feel shamed, then there's a part of you that wants to shame back. And that just becomes an infinity loop where, and you don't even know how much you're hurting your partner's exiles. You just think you're responding to their mean protectors. But every time you try and shame them, it goes right to the heart of their exiles and just makes their protectors that much more extreme. And then you're off to the races.
So in a relationship, would it be, I mean, ideally, we both people are developing some connection to what you call the self with a capital S, that they're doing some inner work so they can have some access to that context. And then from there, it would seem, from what you're saying, that it might be good for them, for their protectors to get to know each other,
Mm-hmm.
and somehow negotiate some relationship uh, as part of sort of managing the rest of the landscape and not having it sabotage their relationality and their ability to hold their relationship from the self with a capital S. Does that make sense?
Sort of. I mean, the way I conceptualize it more is that the two selves talk to each other about their protectors
Uh-huh.
and then negotiate
Uh-huh.
how they can help
Yeah.
each other not
Mm-hmm.
trigger each other so much.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the self to self communication that you're shooting for, and you can never always be in self. So there are times that these protectors will take over, like happened this morning. And so it's also incumbent on you when, in a family, if your kid goes and breaks somebody's window down the street, then you go and you apologize to them and you get them a new window. So if one of my little guys takes over and says something really mean to Gene, then it's incumbent on me later to go and
Mm-hmm.
I'm really sorry I let this part take over and I'm going to work on it.
Isn't there a little bit of the devil maybe do it in there?
There is, but it's sort of true actually, though.
Yeah, I think there is a
It
lot of
wasn't
truth to
myself that did it.
that. Yeah. Well, I think there is something there. I mean, that could sound like a little bit of a game and an excuse, but I think where you're pointing there, that sense of self with a capital S, is there part of our internal landscape that has actually never been touched by all the slings and arrows of life and the traumas?
Yeah, can't be damaged.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been at this 40 years, and I've worked with people that have horrible, horrible childhoods. And even those people, when their parts feel safe enough to open space, it's the same self that pops out. So that blew my mind when I started to run into it. And as I said, I had to turn towards spiritual explanations rather than psychological ones. And, it turns out that most every spiritual tradition, and I know you come from a Buddhist tradition, has a word for it. And Buddhists would probably call it Buddha nature.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, it's Atman in Hinduism or the self, or, I could go down the list. So I think that's what I found a way to fairly quickly access in people simply by getting these parts to open space.
Mm. Well, I want to circle back to that question before we finish today with something, but before going there, another through line in our summit has been the interface, I think, of the summit, the content of it has a lot to do with kind of personal growth, personal evolution, work, and so forth. But there's a through line of the intersection of mindfulness, trauma healing, and neuroscience, and how those three things are informing each other today. And I've been teaching a model of mindfulness for a number of years now that I call neurosomatic mindfulness, which is a very deeply embodied approach to mindfulness and involves developing internal neurobiofeedback systems that allow us to self-regulate it in a deeper and deeper states of somatic awareness. And more recently, I've been working on a model that I'm calling regenerative self-parenting, grounded in that kind of mind training and mindfulness work, which isn't so much, some self-parenting work is about the inner child work. This really isn't involved in narrative. It's more energetic. And by really training ourselves to be able to relax deep, deep, deep into the body, into somatic awareness, it seems like we touch into that same territory you're talking about, that undamaged parts of ourselves. And there can be narrative and images that can come up in that work, but it is, and so I'm wondering if you could say something about the intersection between that kind of embodied and maybe neuroscience informed work and this other work that seems more in the realm of narrative. And but I will say that I've done some voice dialogue and big mind work and experience being in one of those voices, and it literally is you shift into another voice and another. So I know what you're talking about there. And is that another set of neural pathways in the brain? I mean, I don't know if you've explored this connection between these worlds. Yeah.
You know, I have this debate with Bessel van der Kolk all the time because
Aha. Mm-hmm.
he will hold up slides of the brain of trauma survivors, and the prefrontal cortex is totally offline. And he'll say, "This is what we're dealing with. You have to teach these people all these new skills because they didn't get the holding so they just don't have it in their mind."
Mm-hmm.
And I'll say, if you work with the part that's dissociated them when they were in the machine, you would see a very different, if you got it to separate, you would see a very different scan because
Mm-hmm.
self is in there, I promise. And he said, prove it. So we've been trying to do some scans.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's
Um,
fascinating.
yeah. So, yes, I do think probably what you're doing is accessing the same thing that we call self. And and psychedelics are doing that now too. I'm
Mm-hmm.
trying to be a part of the psychedelic revolution
Yes. Mm-hmm.
because, from my point of view, the medicine relaxes protectors very quickly, and
Mm-hmm.
in MDMA anyway, you enter a very embodied state of self.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're in that same place, it's an invitation to all kinds of parts to come now that the protectors aren't locking them up. And so people spontaneously start doing IFS basically. And so it might be that when you're doing this somatically, that parts are coming in to get some attention, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a similar kind of phenomenon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fascinating. I wonder if you could take I have kind of a last question for you in a moment that points to our day focused on the spiritual journey. And it seems like IFS work almost inevitably leads in that direction. But before that, if you could just say a little bit more about the intersection between what we can do ourselves, our own individual work, whether we're doing it internally in some way or doing it with a therapist, and the intersection between that and the work that we do in relationship, or that we might even do with others who are engaged in similar work. So, the intersection and interdependence of, or maybe even the leverage possibilities of working both individually and with others in this kind of work.
Yeah, well, maybe this is getting at what you're talking about. So it turns out that self is contagious, and protectors are contagious.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm in a context where there's a lot of protectors, and it might be in working with a group or it might be just an individual, and I can be in self, there's a kind of resonance inside of people, and it starts to bring their self forward. And so a lot of our work is designed to help therapists know when they're in self and when their parts are in play, and to get their parts to open space so they can be in self while they're with their clients. But that's also what we're teaching to these executive coaches and people that work with social activists and so on. And if I'm in a protector, it's going to trigger the protectors of the people I'm with too. So there is a kind of
Yeah.
intention to try and stay as self-led as possible, even in times of heavy emotion.
Well, that seems to really connect up with Stephen Porges' work around co-regulation and regulation and our social engagement systems being online, and also Dan Siegel and others work around interpersonal neurobiology.
Right.
Yeah, and just more really expanding that whole sense of self into the relational field.
Yeah.
The possibilities seem really rich there.
Yeah, we just do it differently. So, as I prepare to do an interview like this, I'll notice what parts of me are nervous about it, and I'll notice if there's part with a big agenda, like wants to sell something, and I'll just before the interview, I'll say, okay, I get you guys are here, but just let me handle this. Just it always works better if you step back, and I'll talk to you afterwards, and I'll just feel my heart open. I feel my shoulders relax. I feel a lot of somatic things shift as the parts. It's very palpable the way they affect our bodies, and when they open space, you can really sense this kind of vibrating, warm energy running through my body. So it's a very practical way to help people access this place we're talking about.
Well, you just use that expression, stepping back. And I know that's part of your model of inviting uh, some of these parts or protectors to step back for the moment, or maybe even a troublesome part. And could you talk a little bit about that and how that maybe then frees up the self in some way?
Yeah, so most of us spend a lot of time blended with parts that are trying to run our lives.
Mm-hmm.
That's our word is blended. And when a part blends, you see the world through its eyes. I have exercises where I help people do this in a few minutes. If I'll just give you an example. So if I had you think of somebody who generally triggers you and put them in a room with a window and look at them and have them do the triggering thing and notice what happens in your body, the protector, I can see you're going to do it. Okay. The protector who typically they trigger will take over your body temporarily. And if you were to look at them through those eyes and you would actually feel what the protector does to your breathing and to your heart and to your body in general, you'll notice a big shift from the state you were in before I had you do the exercise. And then I can have you start to work with that protector to just separate a little bit, pull its energy out of you a little bit, and then look at the person again. And they'll look totally different through your eyes, and you'll have a very different intention, and so on and so on. So all of that is very palpable. These parts are very real, and they have a big impact on our bodies and our perceptions.
Yeah, absolutely. Really powerful. You mentioned before, how you're training therapists and now executive coaches and leaders to really have more access to being in the self, and a self with a capital S that's not blended or conflated with other parts. And so if they're able to do that, I know, again, Dan Siegel and others, but talk about um, giving the client the experience of being felt, of being seen, and the therapeutic quality of that the kind of way that's so empowering, that expense that I actually feel felt. That my
Yeah,
experience is I feel seen. I have the felt experience. So that's the contagion of the self you're talking about, the
it
positive
is.
contagion.
That is what it is. Yeah, and because I've been at this 40 years, and I can very quickly access a lot of self in almost any context, except with my wife, of course.
Yeah, well, for all of us, yes. With our primary partners, not our wives, but our
Uh,
primary partners. Yes.
so when I go to do a session with somebody, even online now, they feel this presence that's very sort of, I can engender trust in their protectors very quickly through my tone of voice, through my eyes, my face, largely through my tone of voice, actually. And um, and then their protectors will relax fairly quickly in most cases because that's what I'm bringing. And when I have this vibrating energy running through, if I'm present with somebody, often they'll say they literally feel held, even though I didn't touch them, because I can extend that to them and they feel it.
Beautiful. So I would like to sort of ask you a final question, kind of pointing at one of our upcoming summit days focused on spirituality and consciousness. It would seem that the more we do this work that you're describing through internal family systems, uh, it's going to lead in the direction of what we usually point to as the spiritual dimension and consciousness. And So I'm curious about this notion of self with a capital S, because I could see it very much in the sense of, um, maybe a self-aware ego that's able to be in a healthy self-leadership position in our life. But then it seems like it could go farther. You pointed to what in Buddhism is talked about Buddha nature and basic goodness, or the Atman, Brahman in Hinduism, or a more transcendent or non-dual notion of self that is that where that word self with a capital S wouldn't necessarily apply that well anymore, because it's more about the unity of all of us or beingness or something. So I'm just curious about that unfolding from internal family systems work into that kind of that spiritual journey, and what you've experienced and what your people in your work have experienced.
Yeah, I appreciate the question, Fleet. I come a huge way in terms of my journey spiritually, because I come from a very scientific family. I was basically an atheist when I started out, and now I I believe all this. I believe that there's a field of self, or I love the quantum physics metaphor of a
Mm-hmm.
particle and wave, that a photon is both.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this wave of self that's quite transpersonal, and when you enter it, you feel pretty boundaryless, and you
Mm-hmm.
just feel this huge C word of connectedness. But then when you come back from your meditation or from your ketamine or whatever it is into your body, now it's a particle. It's a particle of that big wave. It's the same, but it's inside of you rather than you being inside of it. And and but it is the same for me. This is, lack of a better word, God in us. And a lot of the goal of IFS and many spiritual traditions is not to spend more time up there necessarily, but to bring more of that down here,
Mm-hmm.
because this place, this planet needs a lot of self. It needs a lot of healing. So, yeah.
Yeah, beautifully said. It could be losing track of the particle, could be one definition of spiritual bypassing, maybe, or at least abandoning the world of suffering altogether. But,
Exactly.
but the integration of those two, and I can imagine for those of us, in relationships and wanting to be in relationship with others, our primary relation, to the extent that we can be together, both a particle and a wave, in relationship with others that have a similar commitment, that's going to be kind of an ideal
Totally
situation.
agree. And the other thing is that we're here to learn lessons, and the lesson plan is contained in the set of burdens you got when
Mm-hmm.
when you were young. And so as
Wow.
you unburden, you're opening more space for that to come in more and more. So, uh, I see part of my role now is everybody who unburdens is bringing more of this to this plane. So,
Mm. Well, again, that's a beautiful image to really validate even the burdens we've received as basically the lesson plan and our own stepping stones for personal growth and personal evolution and so forth. Yeah, very beautifully said. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being part of this summit, and I'm sure this is going to really stimulate all kinds of rich explorations for our participants. And so, just thank you so much for the work you do and for being willing to be part of our summit.
thank you, Fleet. I've loved our conversation. It's not that often I can talk at these levels with somebody who knows what I'm talking about. So I really appreciate it.
Well, it was really a joy for me as well. So thank you so much.
You're welcome.